The cannon's roar shook the earth beneath Lieutenant Colonel Nathaniel Reed's feet as smoke billowed across the battlefield. The spring of 1863 had painted Virginia's landscape with wildflowers now trampled beneath the boots of Union and Confederate soldiers alike. Blood soaked into fertile soil as men cried out for mothers they would never see again. "Sir, they've flanked our position." The young messenger's face was streaked with gunpowder and sweat. "Regiments cut off from the main force." Nathaniel surveyed the chaos through his field glass, his mouth set in a grim line. 2,000 men under his command with Confederate forces pressing in from three sides. The only path of retreat lay through a dense woodland to their east, a perfect place for an ambush, but their only hope. "Lieutenant Hayes," he called to a young officer with bright red hair, "take your men through that forest, secure our retreat." Lieutenant Henry Hayes saluted sharply. "Yes, Colonel. How many men?" Nathaniel hesitated, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. 23 should do it. Hand-picked. Your best." Something in Hayes's green eyes told Nathaniel the young man understood what wasn't being said. It was a suicide mission. 23 men to draw Confederate fire so 2,000 might escape. "It's been an honor, sir," Hayes said quietly, tucking a small photograph into Nathaniel's breast pocket. "If I don't return, my sister Eleanor. She's a nurse at the field hospital in Maryland. Tell her I wasn't afraid." Nathaniel nodded, unable to find words, as Henry Hayes gathered his men and disappeared into the tree line. 30 minutes later, gunfire erupted from the forest, and Nathaniel ordered the retreat. As his regiment marched to safety, he couldn't block out the sounds of dying men who had sacrificed themselves on his order. The last face he saw before leaving the battlefield was Lieutenant Hayes, mortally wounded, propped against a tree, blood bubbling from his lips as he whispered his sister's name once more. Eleanor. Eagle Ridge, Montana Territory. July 1874. Nathaniel Reed sat on his porch as the rising sun cast long shadows across the valley. At 38 lines etched his once handsome face like a topographical map of a hard-lived life. His ranch sprawled before him, 300 acres of good grazing land, nestled between rolling hills and a clear running stream. Far enough from town to avoid unwanted company, close enough to trade when necessary. 11 years had passed since Chancellorsville, but the faces of those 23 men still visited him nightly, especially Hayes with those knowing green eyes. Nathaniel's hand absently touched his chest, where the photograph had once rested, the image of a young woman with fierce eyes and copper hair. He'd kept it for years before finally mailing it to the address Hayes had scribbled on the back, along with a letter explaining how bravely her brother had died. He'd never received a reply. He hadn't expected one. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast toward his property. Nathaniel frowned. Few people came this way, and fewer still in such a hurry. He reached inside the doorway for his Spencer rifle, resting it casually across his lap as the rider approached. "Mr. Reed." The boy couldn't have been more than 14, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Reed, they're whipping a woman in town square. Mayor says it's legal, but it ain't right, sir." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Slow down, Jimmy. Who's being whipped?" "Miss Hayes, sir. The lady from the apothecary. She wouldn't marry Mr. Murdoch, and Mayor Wallace authorized public punishment." The boy's voice cracked. "They've already started. Dr. Morrison sent me to fetch you." Nathaniel felt a coldness spread through his chest. Hayes? It couldn't be a coincidence. "The woman, what's her first name?" "Eleanor, sir. Please hurry." The name hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. Eleanor Hayes, the sister, the photograph. The promise he couldn't keep to a dying man. Minutes later, Nathaniel was on his stallion, riding hard toward Eagle Ridge, dust billowing behind him. The town had grown since he'd last visited. New storefronts, a proper courthouse, even a small hotel catering to the railroad surveyors. Progress, they called it. Civilization. As he approached the town square, he heard the crack of leather against flesh, followed by a collective gasp from the gathered crowd. No screams, though. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't giving them the satisfaction of her pain. Nathaniel dismounted, pushing through the ring of onlookers. In the center of the square stood a wooden post where prisoners were sometimes shackled for minor offenses. Tied to it was a woman with copper hair falling in tangles down her back, now streaked with crimson lines. Her dress had been torn open to expose her back, where the whip had already left 5 angry welts. Mayor Wallace stood on a small platform reading from a document. For the crime of refusing a lawful agreement and insulting a respected citizen of this town. 5 more lashes to remind women of their proper place in society. Standing to one side, Victor Murdoch watched with barely concealed satisfaction. At 48, the former Confederate colonel had grown prosperous in the cattle business. His gray-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes fine, but practical. Only his eyes betrayed him cold and calculating, the eyes of a man accustomed to breaking things that wouldn't bend to his will. The deputy raised the whip again, and Nathaniel stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Mayor Wallace squinted into the morning sun. "Nathaniel Reed, this doesn't concern you. This is town business. I'm making it my concern." Nathaniel moved closer to the post, his hand resting casually near his holstered Colt. "Cut her down." "The woman owes a debt," Murdoch interjected, stepping forward. "Her father borrowed money. She can repay it through marriage or suffer the consequences of refusal." "Is that right?" Nathaniel turned to the woman. "Miss Hayes, did your father owe this man money?" Eleanor Hayes raised her head, and Nathaniel felt his breath catch. The photograph hadn't done her justice. Despite the pain and humiliation, her green eyes, so like her brother's, burned with defiance. "My father," she said, her voice steady despite her condition, "never borrowed a cent from Victor Murdoch. This is a fabrication to seize my property and my father's papers." Murdoch laughed. "The delusions of a disobedient woman. Thomas Hayes signed agreements." "Which no one has seen," Eleanor interrupted. "Convenient that you only mentioned this debt after his death." Nathaniel stepped closer to Murdoch. "I'm only going to say this once. Cut her down or I'll do it myself." "You're outnumbered, Reed." Murdoch nodded toward several rough-looking men positioned around the square, hired guns, not townspeople. "Wouldn't be the first time." Nathaniel's voice was dangerously soft. The crowd had fallen silent, sensing the violence hovering in the air, like the metallic tang before a lightning strike. Nathaniel counted 6 of Murdoch's men. Bad odds, but he'd faced worse. "Mr. Murdoch," Nathaniel said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'd like to speak with you privately about this matter." Murdoch's eyes narrowed, but curiosity won out. 5 minutes, Reed, then the punishment continues." They stepped away from the crowd behind the mercantile building. The moment they were alone, Nathaniel seized Murdoch by his expensive lapels, shoving him against the wall. "I know who you are, Murdoch. Or should I say Colonel Murdoch of the 18th Virginia?" Murdoch's eyes widened slightly before his face settled into a smirk. "And I know you, Lieutenant Colonel Reed of the Union Army. The hero of Chancellorsville, or was it the butcher? 23 men sacrificed so you could save your own skin." Nathaniel's grip tightened. "I saved you once after Bull Run. You were bleeding out in a field hospital. I ordered the surgeon to treat you before my own men." "Ah, yes, your misguided sense of honor." Murdoch didn't struggle against Nathaniel's grip. "Consider us even. I could have had you shot as a spy when we crossed paths in Richmond in '64. "I need an accommodation," Nathaniel said, releasing Murdoch but keeping him cornered. "The woman, what's the actual debt?" Murdoch straightened his jacket. $500, but it's not about the money. Thomas Hayes had information documents that rightfully belong to me. I'll pay the debt, 500 in gold. You drop all claims against Miss Hayes and her property." Murdoch laughed. "Since when do you have that kind of money, Reed? I've been ranching for 7 years. Unlike some, I didn't need to steal to rebuild after the war." A flash of anger crossed Murdoch's face before he controlled it. 500 won't buy my silence about what happened at Chancellorsville, about Lieutenant Hayes and his men." Nathaniel felt a familiar coldness settle over him, the battle calm that had served him well during the war. I'm not buying your silence, I'm buying her freedom. The rest is between us. Murdoch studied him, calculating. Very well. 500 in gold, and I relinquish all claims against Eleanor Hayes. A cruel smile played at his lips. But she should know who her savior is, the man responsible for her brother's death. That's my burden to bear, Nathaniel replied. Do we have an agreement? Murdoch extended his hand. We do. But this isn't over between us, Reed. Not by a long shot. They returned to the square where Eleanor remained, bound, her face pale but composed. Murdoch addressed the crowd. It seems there's been a misunderstanding. Mr. Reed has generously offered to settle Thomas Hayes's debt in full. He nodded to the deputy. Release her. As the ropes fell away, Eleanor swayed on her feet. Nathaniel moved forward to steady her, but she flinched from his touch. Dr. Morrison pushed through the crowd, draping a blanket over her shoulders. She needs immediate medical attention, the elderly doctor said, glaring at Mayor Wallace. This barbarism has no place in a civilized town. Take her to my ranch, Nathaniel said quietly. It's safer than the town. I'll bring supplies. Morrison nodded, helping Eleanor toward his wagon. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. Nathaniel caught fragments of conversation, some supportive of Eleanor, others criticizing her defiance. The townsfolk of Eagle Ridge, like most frontier settlements, were a mixture of the honorable and the opportunistic. As Eleanor was helped into the wagon, her eyes met Nathaniel's. There was no gratitude in them, only weariness, and something deeper, a recognition perhaps that she'd traded one form of bondage for another. Nathaniel watched the wagon pull away, then turned to find Murdoch watching him with cold amusement. She doesn't know who you are, does she? The former Confederate officer asked. No, Nathaniel replied. And it's going to stay that way. Murdoch's laugh followed him as he mounted his horse. We'll see, Colonel. We'll see. Eleanor Hayes had endured pain before. As a field nurse during the bloodiest years of the Civil War, she'd witnessed suffering beyond imagination, men torn apart by cannon fire, boys no older than 16 dying of gangrene, the endless screams during amputations performed without enough chloroform. She had developed the ability to separate herself from pain, to observe it as something happening to her body, but not defining her consciousness. This skill served her now as she lay face down on a narrow bed in Nathaniel Reed's ranch house, while Sarah Two Rivers, an elderly Paiute woman, applied a cooling salve to her lacerated back. You strong, the old woman said in halting English. Most cry. You no cry. Crying doesn't help, Eleanor replied, her voice muffled against the pillow. How bad is it? We'll heal, we'll scar. Sarah's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency. I mix special medicine. Less scar, maybe. Eleanor had been slipping in and out of consciousness since arriving at the ranch. Dr. Morrison had given her laudanum for the pain, but she'd refused to take more than a small dose, preferring clarity of mind to comfort of body. Through the haze, she'd caught glimpses of her rescuer, a tall man with prematurely gray-streaked dark hair and haunted eyes. There was something familiar about him that she couldn't place. The man who lives here, Eleanor asked. How do you know him? Sarah continued applying the salve. He saved my grandson 3 winters ago. Blizzard come, boy lost. Mr. Reed find him, carry him home in snow. Since then I help when needed. He lives alone. Yes, no wife, no family, only horses, cattle, and ghosts. Eleanor frowned. Ghosts. War ghosts, Sarah said simply. You have them too, I see in your eyes. Before Eleanor could respond, she heard the door open and footsteps approaching. Nathaniel Reed entered carrying a tray with a steaming pot and cups. Sarah, thank you for your help. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry before you head back to the settlement. The old woman nodded, gathering her medicines. I come tomorrow. Change bandage. She squeezed Eleanor's hand gently before leaving the room. Nathaniel set the tray on a small table. I brought tea. Dr. Morrison said you should drink plenty of fluids. Eleanor managed to push herself up slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at her wounds. Nathaniel immediately stepped forward to assist her, but she waved him away. I can manage, she said more sharply than intended. Softer, she added, thank you for the tea. He poured a cup and set it within her reach, then retreated to the doorway, giving her space. Eleanor studied him properly for the first time. His face bore the weathered look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he'd once smiled more than he did now. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing beneath his collar. He carried himself like a soldier, even in civilian clothes. Why did you help me, Mr. Reed? We've never met. He seemed to consider his answer carefully. I don't abide public whippings, Miss Hayes, or forcing women into marriages against their will. $500 is a considerable sum to pay for a stranger's debt. I can afford it. His gaze was steady, but revealed nothing. Eleanor took a sip of tea, surprised to find it sweetened with honey, just as she preferred. Dr. Morrison told you how I take my tea. A shadow passed over Nathaniel's face. Lucky guess. I'll let you rest. There's a bell on the table if you need anything. I sleep lightly. He turned to leave, but Eleanor called after him. Mr. Reed? Thank you. Not many would have intervened. He paused in the doorway, his back to her. Don't thank me yet, Miss Hayes. Victor Murdoch isn't a man who forgets a slight. You're safe for now, but this isn't over. After he left, Eleanor sank back onto the pillow, exhaustion overwhelming her. Through the small window, she could see stars appearing in the darkening sky. So different from the crowded camp hospitals where she'd spent the war years with their stench of death and sounds of suffering. Here there was only silence and the distant lowing of cattle. As sleep began to claim her, her thoughts drifted to her father. Thomas Hayes had been found dead in his apothecary just 3 weeks ago, reportedly from a fever that had taken him suddenly. Eleanor had returned from her nursing position in Chicago to bury him and manage his affairs, only to find Victor Murdoch claiming ownership of the apothecary due to unpaid debts. Something about her father's death had never felt right. The fever explanation seemed convenient, especially for a man who knew more about treating illness than anyone in the territory. And his papers, journals documenting everything from medical treatments to town business had been in disarray, as if someone had searched through them. What were you involved in, Father? She whispered to the empty room. What did Murdoch want badly enough to fabricate a debt to have me publicly whipped? Sleep pulled her under before she could puzzle it out further into dreams of battlefield hospitals and her brother Henry's face as he marched away for the last time, promising to return. The night closed in around Nathaniel as he sat on his porch, a glass of whiskey untouched beside him. The woman sleeping in his spare room had upended the careful isolation he'd built over the past 7 years. Eleanor Hayes, Henry's sister, the woman from the photograph he'd carried for years after Chancellorsville. He'd recognized her immediately in the town square, older than in the photograph, her youthful softness replaced by the determination of a woman who had witnessed too much suffering. But those eyes were the same. Hayes' eyes, his men had called them. Green as spring grass and just as capable of catching fire when the sun hit them right. Nathaniel took a long swallow of whiskey, welcoming the burn. He'd paid his debt to Victor Murdoch, but not the one he owed to Henry Hayes. That debt could never be paid in full. A soft footfall behind him made him turn. Eleanor stood in the doorway, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She'd found one of his shirts to wear, the sleeves rolled up several times to accommodate her smaller frame. You should be resting, he said, rising from his chair. I've been resting all day. She moved carefully to the second chair, lowering herself with a barely concealed wince. I needed air. Nathaniel offered her his untouched glass of whiskey. For the pain. She accepted it with a nod of thanks and took a small sip. My father used to say whiskey is both the cause of and solution to many of life's problems. Wise man. He was. Eleanor gazed out at the starlit landscape. Mr. Reed, I need to return to town tomorrow. My father's apothecary. Not yet, Nathaniel interrupted. Your wounds need at least a week to heal properly, and Murdoch will be watching the apothecary. I can't impose on you for a week. It's not an imposition. This house has been empty too long. Eleanor studied him, her gaze disconcertingly direct. You were a soldier. It wasn't a question, but Nathaniel nodded. Union Army. War's been over for 9 years. Not for everyone. She took another sip of whiskey. My brother died at Chancellorsville. Lieutenant Henry Hayes. Perhaps you encountered him. He served under a Colonel Reed. She paused, watching his reaction carefully. Any relation? Nathaniel felt as if the ground had fallen away beneath him. She knew, or at least she suspected. I was that Colonel Reed, he admitted quietly. Eleanor's knuckles whitened around the glass. I thought so. There couldn't be many Reed colonels from the Union side who ended up in Montana. Her voice remained level, but her eyes blazed. You sent him into that forest to die. I did. There was no point denying it. 23 men. A suicide mission so the rest of the regiment could escape. Yes. Eleanor set the glass down carefully. Henry wrote to me about you before Chancellorsville. He said you were different from other officers that you cared for. Your men knew their names, their hometowns. Her voice caught. He trusted you. Nathaniel couldn't meet her gaze. He was right to. I wouldn't have sent him if there had been any other way. Was there? The question hung in the air between them, the same question Nathaniel had asked himself every night for 11 years. No, he finally said. The Confederate forces had us surrounded on 3 sides. Without clearing that forest path, 2,000 men would have been captured or killed. So 23 died instead. Yes. Eleanor rose from her chair, the blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders. Thank you for your honesty, Colonel Reed, and for paying Murdoch. Consider any debt to my family paid in full. She turned to go, but Nathaniel's voice stopped her. He gave me your photograph before he went into that forest. The words spilled out before he could stop them. Said if he didn't make it back, I should tell you he wasn't afraid. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her back to him. Was that true? She asked, her voice barely audible. Yes. He died saving others. He knew what he was doing. She nodded once, still not turning. Good night, Colonel. After she disappeared inside, Nathaniel remained on the porch until dawn, the faces of 23 men keeping him company through the long Montana night. For 3 days, Eleanor kept largely to herself, spending most of her time in the small bedroom or sitting on the porch when Nathaniel was out tending to his ranch. Sarah Two Rivers visited daily to change her bandages, bringing herbal remedies and quiet company. On the 4th day, the fever came. Nathaniel found Eleanor delirious in the early morning, her skin burning to the touch. The wounds on her back had become infected despite Sarah's careful ministrations. Henry, she murmured as Nathaniel pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. You promised you'd come back. He sent one of his ranch hands to fetch both Dr. Morrison and Sarah, then settled in for a vigil. Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, other times lost in memories of the war. So many boys, she whispered once her eyes unfocused. They cry for their mothers when the chloroform wears off. I tell them it's raining when they feel tears on their faces. Later, as the sun climbed higher, she grabbed Nathaniel's wrist with surprising strength. You're him, aren't you, the colonel? Henry's colonel. Before he could answer, her eyes slid closed again. Dr. Morrison arrived by midday, his weathered face grim as he examined the infected wounds. The infection's deep, he said, preparing a syringe of morphine. She needs proper medical care, not just my country doctoring. The nearest hospital is in Helena, Nathaniel replied. She wouldn't survive the journey. Then we do what we can here. Morrison administered the morphine, watching as Eleanor's pained expression eased slightly. She was one of the best nurses I ever worked with during the war, served at Antietam, Gettysburg, saved more lives than most of the surgeons. Nathaniel looked up sharply. You knew her during the war? Morrison nodded, packing his medical bag. She was assigned to my field hospital for a time. Fearless girl. Would walk through artillery fire to reach wounded men. He paused, studying Nathaniel. She doesn't know, does she? That you've been carrying her brother's memory all these years. She knows I was his commanding officer. That's all she needs to know. The elderly doctor didn't seem convinced. Sarah's bringing her fever remedy. Between that and the quinine, we might get ahead of the infection. Keep her cool, make her drink when she's conscious. He headed for the door, then turned back. And read. She deserves the truth, whatever it is. After Morrison left, Nathaniel maintained his vigil, replacing the cool cloths on Eleanor's forehead as they warmed from her fever. Sarah arrived with her medicines, brewing a strong-smelling concoction that she spooned carefully into Eleanor's mouth. You care for her, the old woman observed as she worked. More than debt. Nathaniel didn't answer, but Sarah nodded as if he had. War connects people. Blood connects stronger. As night fell, Eleanor's fever peaked. She thrashed against the bed sheets, calling out names Nathaniel didn't recognize, fellow nurses perhaps, or patients lost under her care. Once she cried out her brother's name so plaintively that Nathaniel had to leave the room, his composure cracking. He stood in the hallway, forehead pressed against the cool wood of the wall, remembering Henry Hayes's face in those final moments on the battlefield. The way the young lieutenant had smiled, actually smiled, as death approached, secure in the knowledge that his sacrifice meant something. I'm sorry, Nathaniel whispered to the empty hallway. I'm so damn sorry. By morning, Eleanor's fever had broken. Nathaniel, who had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, woke to find her watching him, her eyes clear for the first time in days. You stayed? She said, her voice hoarse. He straightened, rubbing his stiff neck. How are you feeling? Like I've been trampled by cavalry. She attempted a weak smile, but alive, which I gather was in question. The infection was serious. Dr. Morrison and Sarah pulled you through. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window where early morning light filtered through the curtains. I said things during the fever. About Henry. You did. And about you. She turned back to him. I remembered who you were before you told me. I saw your name in the newspapers after Chancellorsville. Colonel Nathaniel Reed, the officer who saved his regiment through quick thinking and decisive action. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Newspaper accounts rarely tell the whole story. No, she agreed softly. They don't mention the 23 men who made that decisive action possible. She shifted slightly, wincing. I hated you for years, Colonel Reed. When the official letter came about Henry, it mentioned his heroic sacrifice but not the circumstances. Later I read about you in the papers, the hero colonel who would surely be promoted to general. I resigned my commission 3 months after Chancellorsville, Nathaniel said. No promotion. Why? He met her gaze directly. Because I couldn't send any more men to die, not even for the right reasons. Something in Eleanor's expression softened. I need water, she said, changing the subject. And then if you're willing, I'd like to hear about Henry's last moments from someone who was there. Nathaniel brought her water, then pulled his chair closer to the bed. For the first time in 11 years, he spoke openly about that day, the impossible situation, the decision that had haunted him, and the courage of 23 men who had marched into that forest, knowing they might not return. Henry was the last one alive when I found him, Nathaniel concluded, his voice rough with emotion. He was propped against a tree, had taken 2 bullets to the chest. Confederate soldiers were already retreating. They'd suffered heavy casualties from your brother's men. He paused, gathering himself. Henry asked if the regiment had made it through. When I told him yes, he smiled. His last words were your name. Eleanor's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Thank you for telling me. She reached out her hand, hovering uncertainly before settling on his wrist. Henry would understand why I can't forgive you yet, but he would want me to try. The moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Nathaniel moved to the window, tension evident in his posture. Riders coming, at least 4. He grabbed his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Stay here." Eleanor struggled to sit up. "Who is it?" "Can't tell yet, but we're about to have company." Victor Murdoch sat astride his black stallion at the head of 6 riders, watching Nathaniel Reed's ranch house through narrowed eyes. The morning sun glinted off the silver conchos decorating his saddle and the revolver holstered at his hip. "Remember," he instructed the men behind him, "we're here peacefully, to check on Miss Hayes' recovery and extend an invitation to the governor's visit next week." His cold smile didn't reach his eyes. "Reed won't risk a confrontation if we're civil." The men nodded, though their hands remained close to their weapons. They were a rough lot, former soldiers, bounty hunters, men comfortable with violence. Murdoch paid well for loyalty and discretion. As they approached the ranch house, Murdoch noted the improvements Reed had made over the years. Sturdy fences, a newly expanded barn, fields of alfalfa to supplement winter feed for his cattle. The man had prospered in his isolation, building something from nothing, just as Murdoch himself had done after losing everything in the war. The difference was that Reed had fought for the winning side. He hadn't returned home to find his family's plantation burned, his mother dead from illness, his birthright stolen by carpetbaggers and Union sympathizers. Reed hadn't been forced to rebuild from ashes. The front door of the ranch house opened as they approached, and Nathaniel Reed stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually in the crook of his arm. Not pointed at the visitors, but ready to be employed if necessary. "Murdoch," he called. "Didn't expect to see you so soon." Murdoch reined his horse to a stop, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Just being neighborly, Reed. Came to check on Miss Hayes' recovery." "She's recovering. Doctor's orders are rest and quiet. No visitors." Murdoch dismounted, signaling his men to remain on horseback. He approached the porch steps, but didn't ascend. "Governor Kane is making his quarterly visit to Eagle Ridge next week. County assessment, tax collection, the usual official business." He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I've brought Miss Hayes an invitation to the reception. As one of the few professional women in the territory, her presence would be appreciated." Nathaniel didn't take the envelope. "I'll convey your message. Anything else?" Murdoch tucked the envelope back into his jacket. "I was hoping to speak with her directly. As I said, she's resting." The door opened behind Nathaniel and Eleanor stepped onto the porch. She had dressed in her own clothes, which Sarah must have mended and brought from town. Her face was pale but composed, her copper hair neatly braided. "I'm well enough for visitors, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice stronger than it had been earlier. She turned to Murdoch, her expression cooling. "Though some are more welcome than others." Murdoch smiled, removing his hat. "Miss Hayes, I'm pleased to see you recovering from your unfortunate experience." "You mean the public whipping you orchestrated?" Eleanor's directness caused several of Murdoch's men to shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "Yes, I'm recovering, no thanks to you." "A regrettable misunderstanding which has been resolved thanks to Mr. Reed's generosity." Murdoch gestured to the envelope in his jacket. "I've brought an invitation to Governor Kane's reception next week. He specifically requested your presence." Eleanor's expression remained impassive, but Nathaniel noticed her slight stiffening at the mention of the governor. "Please thank the governor for his consideration," she replied, "but I'm not yet well enough for social engagements. The reception isn't for 8 days. Surely you'll be recovered by then." Murdoch's tone remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened. "The governor was quite insistent. He has a particular interest in your father's work." "My father was a simple apothecary." "Was he?" Murdoch smiled thinly. "In any case, the governor will be disappointed if you don't attend. He's not a man who accepts disappointment gracefully." The threat, though veiled, hung in the air. Nathaniel shifted slightly, positioning himself between Eleanor and Murdoch. "Your invitation has been delivered and acknowledged," he said. "Now, unless there's other business, Miss Hayes needs to rest." Murdoch studied them both for a long moment before replacing his hat. "Very well. I'll inform the governor of your tentative response." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, And Miss Hayes, I took the liberty of securing your apothecary while you've been indisposed. Wouldn't want anyone disturbing your father's valuable work. Eleanor stepped forward. You have no right. Actually, I do. As a town council member, I have a duty to secure abandoned businesses. For public safety, you understand. Murdoch mounted his horse. Everything is exactly as you left it. Though I did notice some of your father's journals seem to be missing. Most curious. With a tip of his hat, he wheeled his horse around and rode away, his men following close behind. Eleanor gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. He's been through my father's papers. Looking for something specific, it seems, Nathaniel agreed. And whatever it is, Governor Kane wants it too. I need to return to town, immediately. Nathaniel shook his head. That's exactly what Murdoch wants. He's baiting you, trying to force you back before you're fully recovered. My father kept records of everything patients' treatment's town business. If Murdoch is searching for something in those records... She turned to Nathaniel, her eyes intense. My father didn't die of a fever. I'm sure of it now. What makes you say that? Thomas Hayes was the most knowledgeable medical practitioner in 3 territories. He wouldn't succumb to a common fever without recognizing the symptoms and treating himself. Eleanor's voice was tight with conviction. Something happened to him, something connected to whatever Murdoch is searching for. Nathaniel considered this. Even if you're right, returning to town now is dangerous. Murdoch wouldn't have come here unless he was desperate to find whatever your father hid. I don't have a choice. Those records, that apothecary, they're all I have left of my father. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. But I won't ask you to involve yourself further. You've done more than enough. If you're going, I'm going with you, Nathaniel said firmly. But not until Dr. Morrison says you're fit to travel, and not without a plan. Eleanor looked as if she might argue, then nodded reluctantly. 2 more days. Then regardless of what the doctor says, I'm returning to Eagle Ridge. As she turned to go back inside, Nathaniel caught her arm gently. Eleanor, what do you know about Governor Kane? She hesitated. Only that he was appointed by President Grant 3 years ago. He visits the county seats quarterly to handle territorial business. Her eyes narrowed. Why? Murdoch mentioned him too specifically, and your reaction when he mentioned the governor's interest in your father's work, you tensed. Eleanor's gaze dropped. My father, he mentioned the governor in his last letter to me, said he was looking into some irregularities in land transactions, nothing specific. Land transactions involving Murdoch. Possibly. My father didn't elaborate. She met his eyes again. Why are you still helping me, Colonel Reed? You've paid your debt both to Murdoch and to my brother's memory. Nathaniel released her arm. Maybe I'm tired of standing aside while men like Murdoch and Kane take whatever they want. Or maybe you're still seeking absolution for 23 men who died on your orders. The words struck like a physical blow, but Nathaniel didn't flinch. Maybe I am. Does it matter? Eleanor studied him for a long moment. I suppose not. 2 days, Colonel. Then we go to Eagle Ridge. She disappeared into the house, leaving Nathaniel alone on the porch, watching the dust settle from Murdoch's departure. The peaceful isolation he'd cultivated for 7 years was shattered beyond repair. Ahead lay conflict, danger, and the resurrection of ghosts he'd tried to bury. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him that he'd thought long dead purpose. And perhaps, though he scarcely dared acknowledge it, the first flicker of hope. 2 days passed with the slowness of honey in winter. Eleanor spent the hours regaining her strength, walking the perimeter of Nathaniel's ranch house with increasing steadiness. Her back still burned with every movement, but the infection had cleared, and Sarah Two Rivers' herbal remedies had reduced the worst of the inflammation. At dawn on the 3rd day, Eleanor stood on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose. The beauty of this wild country still caught her by surprise, sometimes so different from the war-ravaged landscapes of Virginia or the crowded streets of Chicago where she'd worked after the war. Here the land stretched endlessly, promising freedom and possibility. Yet even this untamed territory had its dangers, its corruptions. The creak of the door announced Nathaniel's presence before he spoke. Dr. Morrison gave his approval, said you're healing well though he still advises against travel. Eleanor turned to face him. In the days since their confrontation about Henry, a fragile truce had formed between them. Not forgiveness, she wasn't ready for that, but understanding perhaps. I've been away from my father's apothecary too long already, she said. Whatever Murdoch is searching for, he's had ample time to find it. Unless he hasn't. Nathaniel leaned against the porch railing. If your father was as careful as you say, he would have hidden anything important where Murdoch couldn't easily find it. Eleanor nodded. Father was methodical, secretive even. He developed his own system of notation for his most important records, a kind of personal shorthand. That might be what's frustrating Murdoch. He has access to the apothecary but can't decipher what he's found. Nathaniel straightened. I've prepared the wagon. We can leave within the hour. Thank you. Eleanor hesitated, then added, You don't have to come with me. I can manage on my own. A ghost of a smile touched Nathaniel's lips. I have no doubt you can, Miss Hayes. But Murdoch has proven he doesn't play by civilized rules. 2 is safer than 1. Eleanor couldn't argue with that logic. Despite her independence, she wasn't foolish enough to face Murdoch and his men alone, especially in her weakened state. Very well, Colonel Reed. Let's retrieve my father's secrets. The journey to Eagle Ridge took most of the morning, the wagon moving at a careful pace to avoid jostling Eleanor's healing wounds. They traveled in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The vastness of the Montana landscape a buffer against the need for conversation. As they crested the final hill overlooking the town, Nathaniel reined the horses to a stop. From this vantage point, Eagle Ridge looked peaceful, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley with the church steeple and courthouse dome rising above the rest. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the main street bustled with the ordinary commerce of a frontier town. It looks so normal, Eleanor murmured. Hard to believe that just a week ago, I was being publicly whipped in the town square. Nathaniel glanced at her, noting the steel in her voice. People have short memories when it's convenient. Most of those townspeople will pretend it never happened. I won't forget, and I won't let them forget either. Eleanor's eyes hardened. My father believed in justice, Colonel. Not revenge, but true justice. Whatever he was investigating, I intend to finish it. Nathaniel studied her profile, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her green eyes. In that moment, she reminded him so much of Henry that it physically ached. We should have a plan before we enter town, he said, pushing aside the memory. Murdoch will know the moment we arrive. I need to access the apothecary. Everything starts there. Agreed, but not alone and not immediately. We'll establish ourselves at the hotel first, let people see us arrive openly. No sneaking around to raise suspicions. Eleanor nodded. The apothecary has living quarters above the shop. I should stay there. Too isolated, Nathaniel interrupted. The hotel keeps you among people, safer. She looked as if she might argue, then sighed. You're right. The hotel first then. They continued down the hill into Eagle Ridge. As Nathaniel had predicted, their arrival drew immediate attention. People stopped on the boardwalks to watch them pass, whispers following in their wake. By the time they reached the Eagle Hotel, half the town would know Eleanor Hayes had returned, accompanied by the reclusive rancher Nathaniel Reed. The hotel was a 2-story wooden structure with pretensions of grandeur, lace curtains in the windows, and a sign proclaiming Eastern Comforts above the entrance. The proprietress, Mrs. Abigail Porter, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. Miss Hayes, what a surprise to see you up and about. And Mr. Reed, you haven't stayed in town for years. She glanced between them, clearly wondering about the nature of their relationship. How many rooms will you be needing? 2 adjoining rooms if you have them, Nathaniel replied, placing coins on the counter. For at least 3 nights, Miss Porter's eyebrows rose at the generous payment. Of course. 2nd floor rooms 4 and 5. They share a connecting door for convenience. Eleanor met the woman's insinuating gaze directly. Perfect. Colonel Reed is providing security while I attend to my father's business affairs. The connecting door will allow him to respond quickly if there's trouble. The use of Nathaniel's military rank wasn't lost on Mrs. Porter, whose demeanor shifted subtly to one of greater respect. Of course, Miss Hayes. Will you be reopening the apothecary? That remains to be seen. Eleanor accepted the room keys. Is Dr. Morrison in town today? He should be at his office. Shall I send word you're asking for him? Please do. And Mrs. Porter, I'd appreciate your discretion regarding our arrival. At least for a few hours. The older woman's face fell slightly at being denied the pleasure of spreading fresh gossip, but she nodded. As you wish, Miss Hayes, though I can't speak for those who saw you arrive. Once settled in their rooms, Eleanor sank onto the edge of the bed, the journey having taxed her more than she cared to admit. Nathaniel checked both rooms, thoroughly examining locks and sightlines from the windows. The apothecary is visible from here, he noted, looking down at the main street. Murdoch has a man watching it. Eleanor joined him at the window. Below, a rough-looking man lounged against a hitching post opposite her father's shop, his posture casual, but his attention fixed on the building. He won't leave his post even for meals, Nathaniel continued, which means Murdoch is still searching, still hasn't found what he wants. A knock at the door interrupted them. Nathaniel motioned Eleanor back and drew his revolver before calling out, "Who is it? Dr. Morrison," came the reply. Nathaniel holstered his weapon and opened the door, revealing the elderly doctor carrying his medical bag. "Cautious, I see," Morrison remarked, entering the room. "Good. Murdoch's been asking about when you might return, Miss Hayes, rather insistently." "Has he been in the apothecary?" Eleanor asked. "Daily. Brings different men each time, some look like hired muscle, others more official." Morrison set his bag down. "Let me examine your back while we talk." Eleanor sat in a chair and unlaced the top of her dress, allowing the doctor to inspect her healing wounds. Nathaniel discreetly turned his attention back to the window. "The infection's cleared," Morrison pronounced after a moment. "Sarah's remedies worked better than my medicines, I'd wager. You'll have scars, but you're healing well." "Thank you, doctor." Eleanor readjusted her clothing. "What else can you tell me about Murdoch's activities?" The elderly man's face grew grave. "He's been meeting with Mayor Wallace and several town council members. Closed-door meetings at odd hours." He lowered his voice. "And there's talk of Governor Kane arriving early before the official reception." Nathaniel turned from the window. "How early?" "Day after tomorrow, according to Mrs. Wallace. The governor requested private accommodations at the mayor's residence rather than the hotel." Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged glances. "Doctor," Eleanor said carefully, "did my father ever mention any concerns about Governor Kane or Mr. Murdoch? Perhaps regarding land transactions or town business?" Morrison hesitated. "Thomas was cautious in his later months, kept his own counsel more than usual." He stroked his beard thoughtfully. "But he did ask me about symptoms of certain poisons about 3 weeks before his death. Said it was for his medical reference journal." Eleanor's breath caught. What kinds of poisons? Those that might mimic natural illness, arsenic primarily. The doctor's eyes were shrewd. "I wondered at the time. Your father knew more about such things than I did." "And you didn't mention this when he died?" Nathaniel asked, an edge to his voice. "I had no proof, only suspicion. By the time I arrived, he'd been dead several hours. The symptoms were consistent with typhoid fever." Morrison looked at Eleanor apologetically. "Without an autopsy, which Mayor Wallace refused to authorize." "Of course," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "Thank you for telling me now." Morrison packed his bag. "Your father was a good man, Eleanor. This town was better for having him." He moved to the door, then paused. "One more thing. The night before he died, Thomas gave me a small package to deliver to a man in Helena, a federal marshal named Hollister. I made the delivery as promised, but never knew what it contained." After the doctor left, Eleanor stood perfectly still in the center of the room, her face pale but composed. Nathaniel watched her, recognizing the rigid control of someone processing devastating confirmation of their worst fears. He was murdered, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Murdered for whatever he discovered. It seems likely, Nathaniel agreed. The question is, what did he discover, and what evidence did he send to this federal marshal? Eleanor moved to the window, gazing down at her father's apothecary. We need to access the shop, tonight after dark. Agreed, but we need to be careful. If Murdoch's men are watching, they'll report back immediately. Then we need a distraction. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes bright with determination. And I believe I know just how to create one. As dusk settled over Eagle Ridge, Eleanor made her way to the Stagecoach Saloon, the larger of the town's two drinking establishments. Her entrance caused an immediate stir. Respectable women, especially unmarried ones, did not frequent saloons unless accompanying their husbands. She ignored the stares and whispers scanning the room until she found who she was looking for. Jimmy Reeves, the young man who had ridden to fetch Nathaniel on the day of her public punishment, sat at a corner table with several other young cowboys. His eyes widened when he spotted Eleanor approaching. "Miss Hayes," he stammered, rising quickly, "you shouldn't be in here." "I need your help, Jimmy," she said quietly. "You and your friends. It's about my father." The young man glanced at his companions, then back to Eleanor. "Whatever you need, ma'am. We all respected Mr. Hayes. He patched me up more times than I can count, never charged more than I could pay." Eleanor smiled gratefully. "In about an hour, I need a distraction on the south end of town. Something noisy that will draw attention and Murdoch's men away from the main street." Jimmy didn't ask questions, simply nodded. "We can manage that. Billy's got some blasting powder from the mine, been wanting to try it out." "Perfect. Just make sure no one gets hurt." She pressed a coin into his hand. "For your trouble." "Keep your money, Miss Hayes. We're glad to help. Mr. Hayes was good to all of us." Eleanor returned to the hotel where Nathaniel waited, dressed in dark clothing, with his revolver holstered at his side. "It's arranged," she told him. "South end of town in an hour." Nathaniel nodded approvingly. "Good. While we wait, tell me about your father's system, the shorthand you mentioned. What should we be looking for?" Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing her skirts. Father developed a notation system for his most sensitive records. He used botanical Latin combined with numbers, plants, and their properties as a code for people and events. She smiled faintly. "He taught it to me when I was a girl. Said a good apothecary needs to protect certain information, especially about patients." "Clever," Nathaniel remarked, "and effective against someone like Murdoch who wouldn't recognize botanical terms." "Exactly. Father kept two sets of journals, the public ones with ordinary patient information, and his private ones with this special notation." Eleanor's brow furrowed. The private journals would be hidden, not obviously, but in a place that would make sense to another apothecary. "Any ideas where?" "Several. There's a false bottom in one of the herb cabinets, a hollow space behind the bookshelf, and the cellar has some loose stones in the wall." Nathaniel checked his pocket watch. "Almost time. Remember, if we're discovered, we leave immediately. No heroics." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Says the man who faced down 6 armed men to rescue me." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Do as I say, not as I do." They slipped out the back entrance of the hotel, keeping to the shadows as they made their way toward the apothecary. Just as they reached the rear of the building, a tremendous explosion rocked the south end of town, followed by shouts and the sound of running feet. "Your young friends are thorough," Nathaniel murmured as he worked on the back door lock. "Jimmy takes his responsibilities seriously," Eleanor replied, keeping watch. The lock gave way with a soft click and they slipped inside the darkened apothecary. Eleanor immediately felt a rush of emotion, the familiar smells of herbs and tinctures, the comfortable clutter of her father's workspace. It was like stepping back in time before everything had changed. Nathaniel closed the door softly behind them. "Where do we start?" Eleanor lit a small lamp, keeping the flame low. "The herb cabinet first. It's the most accessible." They moved quickly through the shop, aware that their distraction wouldn't last long. The herb cabinet, a tall wooden structure with dozens of small drawers, stood against the back wall. Eleanor knelt before it, her fingers finding a hidden catch beneath the bottom drawer. The false bottom slid open, revealing an empty space. "Empty," she whispered, disappointment evident in her voice. "Murdoch found it," Nathaniel said grimly. "Next location." Eleanor moved to the bookshelf, pulling several medical texts forward to access the wall behind. Her fingers probed the wooden paneling until she found what she was seeking, a small, well-disguised door. It swung open to reveal another empty hiding place. "He's been thorough," Nathaniel observed. "The cellar." Before Eleanor could respond, voices sounded from the street outside. Nathaniel immediately extinguished the lamp, plunging them into darkness. They froze, listening as two men approached the front of the shop. "Waste of time," one was saying. "Murdoch's had us searching for days. Whatever he's looking for ain't here." "Not our job to question," the second replied. "Just keep watch. He thinks the Hayes woman will lead him to it." The men settled on the front porch, the creak of the boards suggesting they had seated themselves for a long vigil. Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged glances in the darkness, both realizing they were now trapped in the apothecary. "The cellar," Eleanor whispered. "There's an outside entrance behind some bushes. We can exit that way." They moved silently toward the trapdoor that led to the cellar, lifting it carefully to avoid noise. The stairs creaked softly as they descended into the cool darkness below. Eleanor led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the space intimately. The cellar was small, primarily used for storing medicines that required cool temperatures. Eleanor moved to the far wall, feeling along the stones until she found what she was looking for, a loose stone that pivoted on a hidden hinge, revealing a cavity behind. "This was his most secure hiding place," she whispered. "He called it his vault." She reached into the opening, her heart pounding. Unlike the other hiding spots, this one was not empty. Her fingers closed around a small leather-bound journal. Eleanor pulled it out, clutching it to her chest with a soft gasp of triumph. "Is that it?" Nathaniel asked, his voice barely audible. "One of them, at least." Eleanor carefully replaced the stone. "Let's go before they decide to check inside." They made their way to the cellar's outside entrance, a slanted door partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. Nathaniel eased it open slowly, checking for any signs of Murdoch's men before helping Eleanor out. They kept to the shadows circling behind buildings until they reached the hotel's rear entrance. Once safely back in Eleanor's room, she placed the journal on the small writing desk, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation and fear. Nathaniel lit the lamp, casting a warm glow over the worn leather cover. "My father's private journal," Eleanor said softly. "His most recent one, judging by the date inscribed on the spine." She opened it carefully, revealing pages filled with neat handwriting, a mixture of normal text, and the specialized notation she had mentioned. Eleanor bent over the journal, her eyes moving rapidly across the pages. "He was investigating land transactions," she murmured after several minutes. "Government land being sold to private interests at a fraction of its value. Murdoch's name appears repeatedly along with Governor Kane's." Nathaniel leaned closer. "Can you decipher it all?" "Most of it. Some entries use codes I'm not familiar with." Eleanor turned more pages, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is worse than I imagined. According to my father, Murdoch and Kane weren't just manipulating land sales for profit. They were specifically targeting land with strategic value." "Strategic for what?" Eleanor looked up, her face pale in the lamplight. "For control of water rights and transportation routes. And," she hesitated, "for displacing the Paiute from their treaty lands." Nathaniel's expression hardened. "Land grabs disguised as legal transactions. It's happening all over the territories." Father writes that he discovered a pattern. Government officials declaring Paiute land abandoned or reclassifying it as unsuitable for their needs, then reassigning it to settlers like Murdoch who paid substantial bribes. Eleanor continued reading. "He suspected Governor Kane was receiving a percentage of every transaction." That would explain their desperation to recover these journals. It's evidence of criminal conspiracy. Eleanor turned to the final entries, her breath catching. The last entry is dated the day before his death. He writes that he compiled evidence of 23 fraudulent land transactions and sent copies to a federal marshal named Hollister. The package Morrison delivered, Nathaniel confirmed. But he also mentions the final proof being hidden where only Eleanor would think to look. She closed the journal, frustration evident in her voice. What does that mean? Where would I think to look? Nathaniel placed a hand on her shoulder. You'll figure it out. But not tonight. We've pushed our luck enough for one evening. Eleanor nodded reluctantly, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. The emotional strain of confirming her father's murder, combined with her still healing injuries, had drained her completely. You're right, we should rest. She carefully wrapped the journal in a handkerchief and placed it under her pillow. But tomorrow we need to learn more about this Marshal Hollister and what happened to the evidence my father sent him. Nathaniel moved toward the connecting door to his room. I'll ask around discreetly. If the marshal received evidence of corruption involving the territorial governor, there should have been an investigation. Unless the evidence never reached the proper authorities, Eleanor said grimly. Or unless those authorities are also compromised. Nathaniel paused in the doorway. Get some rest, Eleanor. You're safe tonight. After he closed the door, Eleanor sat for a long while staring at the lamp's flame. Her father had been murdered for uncovering a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of territorial government. She had his journal, but not the final proof. He'd mentioned the evidence that would truly expose Murdoch and Kane. Where would only I think to look? She whispered to the empty room. What place or object held special significance to both her and her father? Something so personal that only she would understand its importance. Sleep claimed her before the answer came. Her dreams filled with her father's voice, trying to tell her something just beyond her understanding. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Eagle Ridge. The explosion at the south end of town, which had fortunately damaged only an abandoned shed, was the primary topic of conversation. Mayor Wallace had ordered increased patrols, suspecting outside agitators might be responsible. Nathaniel left the hotel early, ostensibly to check on his wagon and horses at the livery stable. In reality, he was gathering information, carefully questioning people he trusted about federal marshals and any recent investigations in the territory. Eleanor remained in her room studying her father's journal more thoroughly. The code was complex and some entries remained opaque even to her trained eye. But the overall picture was clear. Thomas Hayes had documented a pattern of corruption that implicated both Victor Murdoch and Governor Marshall Kane in a scheme to defraud the federal government and the Paiute tribe of valuable land. Around midday, a soft knock at her door startled Eleanor from her reading. She quickly hid the journal before answering. Sarah Two Rivers stood in the hallway, her weathered face grave. I come with news, she said quietly. From Joseph Crow Feather. You must hear. Eleanor ushered the elderly Paiute woman into her room, closing the door firmly behind her. What's happened? Governor Man, come early, last night. Secret meeting with Murdoch Man at hunting cabin outside town. Sarah's dark eyes were troubled. Joseph's grandson watch cabin. See many papers maps of our land. Eleanor felt a chill. Governor Kane is already here. Are you certain? Sarah nodded. Young Brave follow Governor Man from Fort Harrison yesterday. Come straight here, not stop. This changed everything. If Kane had arrived early and in secret meeting with Murdoch away from town, they were clearly planning something imminent. Sarah, did Joseph send any other message? The old woman reached into the pouch at her waist, withdrawing a small object wrapped in soft leather. He say give this to you. Say your father want you to have when time right. Eleanor unwrapped the object with trembling fingers. Inside lay a small brass key with an unusual serrated edge. She stared at it, uncomprehending. What is this for? Joseph not know. Your father give to him before death. Say keep safe for Eleanor. She know when to use. Sarah rewrapped the key and pressed it back into Eleanor's hand. Hide well, important Joseph say. After Sarah left, Eleanor examined the key more carefully. It wasn't a door key or a cabinet key too small, wrongly shaped. Yet it was definitely a key to something. She turned it over in her palm, noting a tiny engraving near the head TH, 1871. Her father's initials and a date, 3 years ago. What had happened in 1871 that was significant enough for her father to mark it on this key? Eleanor was still pondering this question when Nathaniel returned, his expression grave. "We have a problem," he said without preamble. "Governor Kane arrived last night secretly. He's staying at a hunting cabin outside town, not at the mayor's residence as announced." "I know. Sarah Two Rivers just told me." Eleanor showed him the key. "And she brought this from Joseph Crow Feather. My father left it with him before he died." Nathaniel examined the key. "Any idea what it opens?" "No, but it's marked with my father's initials and the year 1871. Eleanor frowned. "I was in Chicago then, working at the hospital. Father visited me that summer, the only time he ever left Montana during those years." "Something happened during that visit?" Eleanor's eyes widened suddenly. "The bank. He opened a safety deposit box at the Chicago Mercantile Bank. Said it was a precaution, a secure place to keep important papers in case something happened to the apothecary. This could be the key to that box." Nathaniel turned it over in his palm. "But Chicago is 1,000 miles away." "He would have made a local copy of whatever he stored there," Eleanor said with certainty. "Father was methodical. He wouldn't rely on evidence stored so far away." "Then this key likely opens whatever contains that local copy." Nathaniel pocketed the key. "What did you learn from the journal?" Eleanor summarized her findings, including the pattern of land transactions and the evidence her father had sent to Marshal Hollister. "I made some inquiries about Hollister," Nathaniel said. "He was a federal marshal based in Helena until 3 months ago, when he was reassigned to Wyoming Territory. Rather suddenly, according to my sources. After my father sent him evidence implicating the governor," Eleanor noted. "Convenient timing." "Very. And there's more. Before leaving, Hollister visited Eagle Ridge and met with your father. The meeting was observed by several people, including Dr. Morrison." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "When was this?" "2 days before your father died." The implications were clear. Thomas Hayes had sent evidence to Marshal Hollister, who had then visited him in person. Shortly afterward, Hayes was dead, and Hollister was reassigned to a distant post. "They silenced them both," Eleanor whispered. "Killed my father, and removed the marshal." "It appears so." Nathaniel leaned against the window frame, his expression thoughtful. "But they're still searching for something, the final proof your father mentioned." "Which means they don't know about the safety deposit box in Chicago," Eleanor concluded, "or this key." A commotion in the street below drew their attention. Through the window they could see Victor Murdoch and several well-dressed men entering the courthouse, accompanied by an escort of armed men. "That's Governor Kane," Nathaniel said, recognizing the distinguished-looking man at the center of the group, "making his official arrival now that the proper reception has been prepared." Eleanor studied the governor with cold intensity. Marshal Kane was in his early 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and the polished appearance of a career politician. He moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to power and deference. "He doesn't look like a murderer," she murmured. "They rarely do." Nathaniel turned from the window. "We need to find what this key opens before they realize we have it." Eleanor nodded, but her attention had been caught by something else, a small ornate box sitting on the mantelpiece in her father's quarters above the apothecary, visible through the window across the street. "The music box," she said suddenly. "Father brought it back from Chicago in 1871. A gift for me, he said, though he kept it at the apothecary until I returned from nursing." Nathaniel followed her gaze. Too obvious a hiding place, surely. Not for my father. He believed the best place to hide something important was somewhere meaningful but not secret. Eleanor's eyes shone with certainty. "The music box has a decorative lock that I always assumed was purely ornamental. I never tried to open it because the winding key for the music mechanism is on the bottom." "A second hidden compartment requiring a specific key," Nathaniel said with growing excitement, hiding in plain sight. Exactly. Eleanor moved toward the door. We need to get that music box. Nathaniel caught her arm. Not now. The street is too busy and Murdoch's men will be watching more carefully after last night's break-in. He glanced out the window again. Tonight, after the governor's reception. The reception? Eleanor frowned. We're not attending, Shirley. On the contrary, Nathaniel said, a grim smile forming. I believe it's time we accepted the governor's gracious invitation. It will give us the perfect opportunity to access the apothecary while Murdoch and his men are occupied at the courthouse. Eleanor considered this. A bold strategy, but risky. Sometimes the most direct approach is the least expected. Nathaniel's eyes held a glint of the tactical acumen that had once made him a formidable officer. Besides, I think it's time you met the man responsible for your father's death. Don't you? A cold determination settled over Eleanor's features. Yes, I believe it is. The governor's reception was held in the newly completed courthouse, the most impressive building in Eagle Ridge. Lanterns illuminated the entrance where a small but enthusiastic crowd had gathered to catch a glimpse of the territorial dignitaries. Inside the main courtroom had been transformed with bunting flowers and tables laden with refreshments, a display of civilization in the frontier wilderness. Eleanor entered on Nathaniel's arm wearing her best dress, a deep green silk that complemented her copper hair and brought out the color of her eyes. The garment had been carefully altered to avoid pressure on her healing back. Nathaniel wore a formal black suit that transformed him from frontier rancher to distinguished gentleman, though the revolver concealed beneath his jacket suggested he hadn't entirely abandoned practicality for appearance. Their entrance caused a stir among the assembled townsfolk and visiting officials. Eleanor felt the weight of curious stares and whispered comments, but held her head high. 1 week earlier, she had been publicly humiliated in this town square. Tonight she walked among them, as an equal, her dignity restored. Mayor Wallace approached them immediately, his expression a mixture of surprise and unease. Miss Hayes, Mr. Reed, we hadn't expected you to attend. The governor specifically requested my presence, Eleanor replied coolly. It would be impolite to decline such an honor. Wallace's discomfort increased visibly. Yes, well, he's currently engaged with some territorial officials. I'm sure he'll be available shortly. As the mayor retreated, Nathaniel leaned close to Eleanor's ear. Murdoch is watching from across the room. He looks concerned by our appearance. Eleanor didn't turn to look. Good. Let him worry about what we might know. They circulated through the reception, accepting refreshments and engaging in polite conversation with those brave enough to approach them. Most of the townspeople maintained a respectful distance, unsure how to interact with a woman they had recently seen whipped in public, now moving confidently among them. Dr. Morrison joined them briefly, ostensibly to inquire after Eleanor's health, but actually to murmur, Governor Kane asked about you specifically before you arrived, wanted to know if you'd been through your father's papers. This confirmation that they were being watched only strengthened Eleanor's resolve. The music box was their target for the night, but this reception provided an opportunity to observe their adversaries up close to gauge their concerns and priorities. After nearly an hour, a hush fell over the gathering as Governor Marshall Kane made his formal entrance into the main reception area. He was accompanied by Victor Murdoch and several officials Eleanor didn't recognize. The governor moved through the crowd with practiced charm, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, gradually working his way toward where Eleanor and Nathaniel stood. Miss Hayes, he said when he finally reached them, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. A pleasure to finally meet you. Your father spoke highly of your accomplishments in nursing. Eleanor offered her hand with outward composure, though inwardly she recoiled at contact with the man she believed had ordered her father's murder. Governor Kane, you knew my father well. We had several illuminating conversations about territorial development. Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. Thomas Hayes was a man of strong opinions and civic-mindedness. His passing was a great loss to Eagle Ridge. Yes, Eleanor agreed, holding his gaze. A sudden and unexpected loss. A flicker of something caution perhaps crossed the governor's face before his politician's mask slipped back into place. He turned to Nathaniel. "And Colonel Reed, your reputation precedes you. A war hero turned reclusive rancher. What brings you out of isolation?" Miss Hayes required assistance after her unfortunate experience. Nathaniel's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were cold. "I believe in supporting those who have been wrongfully treated." Kane nodded, glancing between them. "Admirable. I understand you settled a financial matter with Mr. Murdoch on Miss Hayes' behalf. Quite generous for someone with no prior connection to the family." The implication hung in the air that Nathaniel's involvement was suspicious, perhaps motivated by something other than altruism. "I dislike seeing power abused," Nathaniel replied evenly, "particularly against those unable to defend themselves." "A noble sentiment," Kane's smile thinned, "though I find that most situations are more complex than they initially appear. Wouldn't you agree, Miss Hayes?" "Indeed, Governor," Eleanor responded. "Like my father's investigation into territorial land transactions, quite complex as I understand it." The direct reference to her father's work caused a momentary falter in Kane's composure. Beside him, Murdoch stiffened visibly. Thomas had many interests. Kane recovered smoothly. "Though I wasn't aware he was investigating anything official, that would be the purview of territorial authorities. My father believed in justice, Governor, even when pursuing it might be inconvenient for some." The challenge in her words was unmistakable. Kane's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, the cordial mask slipping to reveal something colder beneath. "Miss Hayes, I would welcome a private conversation about your father's work. Perhaps tomorrow I'm sure we could clarify any misunderstandings." "I look forward to it," Eleanor replied, her smile not reaching her eyes. As Kane moved on to greet other guests, Murdoch lingered, his gaze calculating. "Playing a dangerous game, Eleanor," he said quietly. "Your father didn't understand the stakes either, until it was too late." Nathaniel stepped forward slightly, positioning himself between Eleanor and Murdoch. "That sounded remarkably like a threat, Murdoch." "Merely an observation, Colonel." Murdoch's cold smile returned. "Eagle Ridge is a hazardous place for those who pry into matters that don't concern them. Accidents happen frequently in frontier towns." With that parting remark, he followed the governor, leaving Eleanor and Nathaniel standing in tense silence. "He all but admitted to murdering your father," Nathaniel murmured, "and threatened the same fate for us." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "We need that music box, tonight." They remained at the reception for another half-hour, maintaining appearances while observing the interactions between Kane Murdoch and the other officials. The governor kept glancing in their direction, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the evening progressed. When the opportunity presented itself, Nathaniel and Eleanor slipped away from the courthouse. The streets were relatively deserted, most of the town's prominent citizens being at the reception. Even the guard usually posted outside the apothecary had been reassigned to the courthouse for the evening. They approached the apothecary from the rear as they had the previous night. This time, however, Eleanor led them not to the shop, but to the side staircase that accessed the living quarters above. "The music box is in my father's sitting room," she whispered as Nathaniel worked on the lock. "On the mantelpiece." The lock yielded quickly and they entered the darkened stairwell. Eleanor led the way up, moving with the confidence of someone returning home. The living quarters were modest but comfortable, a sitting room, small kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. Everything was exactly as it had been when Eleanor left the night after her father's burial. On the sitting room mantelpiece stood a wooden music box about the size of a small book. Elaborately carved with botanical motifs, it featured a small decorative keyhole on the front panel, separate from the winding mechanism underneath. Eleanor took the brass key from Nathaniel with trembling fingers. It fit perfectly into the keyhole, turning with a soft click. The front panel of the music box swung open, revealing not the expected musical mechanism, but a hidden compartment containing a small leather portfolio. "This is it," Eleanor breathed carefully, removing the portfolio. Father's final proof. They had no time to examine the contents there. Quickly relocking the music box and leaving everything else undisturbed, they made their way back down the stairs and into the alley behind the apothecary. The night had grown colder, a gusty wind sending leaves skittering along the boardwalks as they hurried back to the hotel. Safe in Eleanor's room, they spread the contents of the portfolio on the small writing desk. Inside were several documents, land deeds maps with annotations and letters bearing the territorial governor's seal. Most significantly, there was a ledger detailing payments between Murdoch Governor Kane and several other territorial officials. "This is incredible," Eleanor said, examining the ledger. "Direct evidence of bribes paid for fraudulent land transactions, signatures, dates, amounts." Nathaniel studied one of the maps. "These markings show Paiute treaty lands that were reclassified and sold to private interests." His finger traced a particular section, "including parts of what is now my ranch." Eleanor looked up sharply. "Your land was part of their scheme." "Apparently so, though I purchased it legally from the previous owner." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Which explains Murdoch's interest in driving me out over the years. My property controls access to the Northern Valley watershed." As they continued examining the documents, a particular letter caught Eleanor's attention. It was from her father to Marshal Hollister, dated 1 week before Thomas Hayes's death. The letter detailed the evidence compiled against Kane and Murdoch, but more importantly, it revealed the full scope of their conspiracy. "It wasn't just about land," Eleanor said, her voice hollow with shock. "They were planning to forcibly relocate the entire Paiute tribe to a reservation in Nevada against the terms of their treaty. The land transactions were preparation for a much larger land grab." Nathaniel took the letter, reading it with growing anger. "They needed control of the water rights and transportation routes before initiating the removal. Your father discovered their timeline." He looked up. "According to this, they're planning to begin the forced relocation immediately after the governor's official visit." Which is now, Eleanor realized, within days. The sound of boots on the hotel stairs interrupted their discovery. Heavy footsteps approached, stopping outside Eleanor's door. Nathaniel immediately gathered the documents, thrusting them into Eleanor's hands. "Hide these," he whispered urgently. "Use the connecting door. Go to my room." As Eleanor hurried to comply, a loud knock rattled the door. "Miss Hayes, this is Deputy Clark. Open up, please." Nathaniel waited until Eleanor had secured the connecting door before answering. He opened the door to find the deputy and 2 of Murdoch's men standing in the hallway. "Can I help you, deputy?" Nathaniel asked calmly. "Colonel Reed." The deputy looked surprised, then uncomfortable. "I'm looking for Miss Hayes. Governor Kane requests her presence immediately at the courthouse. Official business." "At this hour, the reception must be nearly over." "These are my orders, sir." The deputy glanced at Murdoch's men, who stood like sentinels behind him. "The governor was most insistent." Nathaniel sized up the situation quickly. 3 men in the hallway, possibly more waiting below. A confrontation now would be dangerous and might expose the documents they'd just recovered. "Miss Hayes retired early," he said. "The day's activities exhausted her. Please convey her apologies to the governor and assure him she'll call upon him tomorrow as arranged." The deputy hesitated, clearly torn between completing his assignment and challenging a man of Nathaniel's reputation. One of Murdoch's men stepped forward. "Our instructions were to escort the lady to the courthouse," he said, his hand resting suggestively near his holstered weapon. "Not to return without her." Nathaniel's posture shifted subtly, his own hand moving closer to his concealed revolver. "The lady is resting. I won't disturb her for anything less than an emergency." Tension crackled in the narrow hallway. The deputy, sensing the potential for violence, raised his hands placatingly. "Perhaps a compromise. If Miss Hayes is truly resting, we'll return in the morning. First thing." He glanced nervously between Nathaniel and Murdoch's men. "The governor's business can wait that long, I'm sure." After a moment of silent standoff, Murdoch's men reluctantly backed down. "Morning, then," one growled. "But we'll be watching the hotel all night." After they departed, Nathaniel quickly locked the door and moved to the connecting door. Eleanor stood just inside his room, the portfolio clutched to her chest, her face pale with tension. "They know," she whispered. "They know we have the documents." "Not for certain," Nathaniel countered, "but they suspect. Someone must have seen us enter or leave the apothecary." He took the portfolio from her, securing it inside his saddlebag. "We can't stay here. They'll return with more men or a more official order." "Where can we go? They'll be watching all the exits." Nathaniel checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded. "There's only one safe place now. We need to reach Joseph Crow Feather and the Paiute settlement. Their land is outside territorial jurisdiction." "That's at least 15 miles from here," Eleanor protested. "And they'll be watching the livery stable for our horses." "We won't take the main road." Nathaniel began gathering their essential belongings. "There's a back way out of town through the creek bed. It adds distance but provides cover." Eleanor moved to assist him, her actions quick and decisive despite her fear. "How soon can we leave?" "As soon as you're ready. We'll go out through my window. There's a roof below that leads to the alley behind the hotel." As Eleanor returned to her room to collect her few possessions, including her father's journal, Nathaniel stared out at the darkened town. The peaceful isolation he had cultivated for years had been irrevocably shattered. Ahead lay conflict, danger, and the resurrection of ghosts he'd tried to bury. Yet despite the peril, he felt more alive than he had in years. The empty numbness that had plagued him since Chancellorsville had been replaced by purpose and by something else he scarcely dared acknowledge. Something that flickered to life whenever Eleanor's determined green eyes met his. 20 minutes later, they slipped through Nathaniel's window onto the sloping roof below, the evidence of corruption and murder secured in their possession, and the long journey to the Paiute settlement ahead of them. Behind them, in the governor's temporary office at the courthouse, Marshal Kane slammed his fist on the desk in frustration. "Find them," he ordered Murdoch. "Whatever it takes. Those documents cannot reach federal authorities." Murdoch's cold smile held no humor. "Don't worry, Governor. They won't leave Eagle Ridge alive." As if to punctuate his words, a distant roll of thunder sounded from the mountains. A storm was brewing both in the heavens and in the human hearts beneath them. The peaceful Montana night was about to erupt into violence once more. The storm that had threatened from the mountains arrived with unexpected ferocity shortly after midnight. Rain lashed the Montana landscape, turning the creek bed Nathaniel and Eleanor had been following into a treacherous, swollen waterway. They were forced to abandon their planned route, seeking higher ground, as lightning split the sky in jagged bursts. "We need shelter," Nathaniel shouted over the wind rain, plastering his dark hair to his forehead. "There's an old trapper's cabin about half a mile east, if it's still standing." Eleanor nodded, too cold and wet to speak. Her healing back throbbed with each movement, the journey reopening wounds that had barely begun to close. She followed Nathaniel through the darkness, trusting his knowledge of the terrain even as the deluge reduced visibility to mere feet ahead. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a dilapidated shack, its roof partially collapsed, one wall leaning dangerously. But the corner furthest from the damaged section remained relatively dry, and Nathaniel quickly cleared space for them to rest. "It's not much," he apologized, spreading his coat on the dirt floor for Eleanor to sit. "But it should hold until morning." Eleanor sank down gratefully, her sodden skirts weighing like anchor chains. "I've slept in worse places. Field hospitals during the Atlanta campaign made this look palatial." Nathaniel managed to get a small fire going in the remains of the stone hearth, using dry kindling he found beneath a sheltered stack of firewood. The flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin's interior, illuminating their exhausted faces in flickering orange light. "We're still 8 miles from the Paiute settlement," he said, checking that the portfolio containing Thomas Hayes's evidence remained dry inside his oilskin-wrapped saddlebag. "We'll need to move at first light before Murdoch's men pick up our trail." "Will they follow us in this weather?" Eleanor asked, holding her hands toward the meager warmth of the fire. "Murdoch will. He can't afford to let these documents reach federal authorities." Nathaniel sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "And he knows these hills as well as I do." Eleanor nodded, her expression grim. He'll have men watching all the roads to Helena and the stage routes. Which is why we're going to the Paiute first. Joseph Crowfeather can get word to the authorities through channels Murdoch won't expect. They fell silent, listening to the storm rage outside. Thunder rolled across the valley and rain drummed against what remained of the cabin roof. Despite their dire circumstances, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace in this moment, as if they had stepped outside of time into a pocket of stillness amidst the chaos. "Do you think my father knew," she asked suddenly, "that investigating this land fraud would cost him his life?" Nathaniel considered the question carefully. "I think he understood the risk, but he believed the truth was worth it." "And was it?" Her voice grew tight. "Was the truth worth dying for?" "Your father thought so," Nathaniel replied quietly, "as did your brother Henry when he led those men into the forest at Chancellorsville." Eleanor stared into the flames. "My family has a history of choosing principle over survival." "It's not a common trait," Nathaniel said, "especially in these territories where most come to escape their past or build fortunes regardless of the cost." "Why did you come to Montana, Colonel?" Eleanor asked, turning to study his profile in the firelight. "After you resigned your commission." Nathaniel was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I came to disappear. After Chancellorsville, after sending 23 men to their deaths, I couldn't bear the weight of command anymore." He paused, shadows deepening the lines of his face. "I needed empty spaces, places where no one would look to me for decisions that determined whether they lived or died." "And did you find what you were looking for?" "For a time. I built the ranch, established a life of sorts, but the emptiness followed me." His gray eyes reflected the dancing flames. "Until a week ago, when I rode into Eagle Ridge and saw a woman being whipped for her defiance." Eleanor's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "I've brought nothing but danger into your life." "You've brought purpose," he corrected. "Something I'd forgotten I needed." The simple admission hung in the air between them, more intimate than any declaration of affection might have been. Eleanor found herself unable to look away from his face, the face of the man who had ordered her brother to his death, who had saved her from public humiliation, who now risked his life to help her expose a conspiracy that had killed her father. "We should try to rest," Nathaniel said, breaking the moment. "Tomorrow will be difficult." Eleanor nodded, settling back against the cabin wall. Despite her exhaustion, sleep seemed impossible with the storm raging and her mind churning with all they had discovered. Yet somehow, with the steady presence of Nathaniel Reed beside her and the small fire warming the space between them, she eventually drifted into a fitful slumber. Her last conscious thought was that she no longer saw him as Colonel Reed, the officer who had sent Henry to die. Now he was simply Nathaniel, a man seeking redemption in the same measure that she sought justice. Dawn arrived with pale, watery light filtering through the cabin's broken roof. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed, trees stripped of leaves, creek beds overflowing, and the distant mountains shrouded in mist. Eleanor woke to find Nathaniel already up, tending the small fire where he was heating coffee in a battered tin cup. "You managed to save coffee?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. He offered a rare smile. "Some things are essential even when fleeing for one's life." The simple domesticity of the moment struck Eleanor powerfully. In another life, in another time, this might have been an ordinary morning between two people who cared for each other. The thought sent an unexpected pang through her chest. They shared the coffee in silence, both aware of the dangers that awaited them beyond the cabin's dubious shelter. When they had finished, Nathaniel carefully extinguished the fire. "The storm will have washed away most of our tracks," he said, gathering their few belongings. "But it also means the creeks will be difficult to cross. We'll need to head further east before turning north to the Paiute settlement." Eleanor straightened her damp clothing as best she could, wincing as the movement pulled at her healing wounds. "How well do you know Joseph Crowfeather?" Well enough to trust him with our lives, Nathaniel replied. He saved mine once during my first winter here. I got caught in a blizzard, lost my bearings. Would have frozen to death if his hunting party hadn't found me. Sarah mentioned that you've helped the Paiute as well. Nathaniel nodded, his expression turning grim. I've seen how the territorial government treats them. Broken promises, stolen land, starvation conditions. I do what I can, provide supplies, speak on their behalf at territorial meetings. It's never enough. And now we've discovered they're planning to relocate the entire tribe against treaty obligations. Which is why Joseph needs to see this evidence. Nathaniel secured the saddlebag containing the portfolio. Ready. Eleanor nodded, and they set out into the damp morning. The going was difficult, as Nathaniel had predicted. Normally dry ravines had transformed into rushing streams, and the muddy ground made each step treacherous. They moved as quickly as caution allowed, Nathaniel frequently offering his hand to steady Eleanor across particularly difficult terrain. By midday they had covered perhaps 4 miles, half the distance to the Paiute settlement. They paused to rest in a grove of pines, sharing the last of their meager provisions. As Eleanor leaned against a tree trunk, gathering her strength, Nathaniel suddenly tensed his hand, moving to his revolver. "What is it?" she whispered, instantly alert. "Riders," he murmured, eyes scanning the ridgeline to their west. "At least 3 moving fast." Eleanor followed his gaze and caught a glimpse of mounted men silhouetted against the sky before they disappeared behind the ridge. "Murdoch's men." "Most likely. They're cutting across country, trying to intercept us before we reach the Paiute land." Nathaniel's expression was grim. "We need to move. Now." They abandoned their rest, pushing forward with renewed urgency. The terrain grew more challenging as they approached the foothills that marked the boundary of the Paiute settlement. Twice more they spotted riders in the distance, confirming Nathaniel's fear that Murdoch's men were closing in, circling like wolves around weakened prey. As the afternoon waned, they reached a steep ravine. At the bottom, a stream that would normally be easily fordable had swollen to a rushing torrent. On the far side lay the approach to the Paiute lands. "We have to cross," Nathaniel said, studying the churning water. "There's no time to find an easier passage." Eleanor eyed the current dubiously. "It's at least 4 feet deep in the middle. I'll go first, test the footing, then I'll come back for you." Before she could protest, Nathaniel handed her his revolver. "Keep this. If you see riders, don't hesitate." He began his descent into the ravine, picking his way carefully down the muddy slope. Eleanor watched anxiously, the revolver heavy in her hand. When Nathaniel reached the water's edge, he paused to secure the saddlebag more firmly before wading in. The current immediately grabbed at his legs, but he pressed forward, using a sturdy branch as support. The water rose to his waist as he reached the middle, its force threatening to sweep him away with each step. Eleanor held her breath as he fought his way to the far bank, finally pulling himself onto solid ground. He waved to her, indicating he would return for her, when a shout from behind made Eleanor whirl around. 3 riders had emerged from the tree line not 200 yards away. Murdoch himself was in the lead, his face a mask of cold determination even at this distance. "Run!" Nathaniel shouted from across the stream. "Get to the water! I'll cover you!" Eleanor didn't hesitate. She plunged down the ravine slope, half sliding in the mud as the riders closed in. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet striking a tree just feet from her head. She raised Nathaniel's revolver and fired back, not aiming to hit, but to slow their pursuit. When she reached the water's edge, she glanced back to see Murdoch and his men dismounting, taking cover behind trees as they returned fire. Nathaniel had drawn his rifle from the saddlebag and was providing covering fire from the opposite bank. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them off." But Eleanor couldn't leave him there, outnumbered and exposed. Instead of crossing, she took position behind a large boulder at the water's edge, using the revolver to pin down Murdoch's men, while Nathaniel attempted to pick them off with his more accurate rifle. For several minutes the ravine echoed with gunfire. One of Murdoch's men cried out, struck in the shoulder by one of Nathaniel's shots. But they were still 2 against 3, and Eleanor knew their ammunition was limited. Eleanor, Nathaniel called during a lull in the firing. The documents, if we don't make it, the evidence dies with us. He was right. The portfolio contained the only proof of the conspiracy proof that could save the Paiute from forced relocation and bring Kane and Murdoch to justice for her father's murder. Personal survival had to be secondary to that mission. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor plunged into the rushing stream. The cold water shocked her system, and the current immediately threatened to sweep her away. She fought against it, pushing forward one agonizing step at a time. Behind her, gunfire erupted again as Nathaniel provided covering fire. A bullet struck the water near her, sending up a spray that momentarily blinded her. She staggered, losing her footing, and the current caught her fully. For a terrifying moment, Eleanor was underwater, tumbling in the powerful flow. Then strong hands grabbed her, pulling her to the surface. Nathaniel had waded back into the stream, risking his own safety to reach her. Together they fought their way to the far bank, collapsing on the muddy shore as bullets continued to strike around them. Nathaniel pulled Eleanor behind a fallen tree, providing minimal cover as they caught their breath. "We need to reach the tree line," he gasped, nodding toward the forest some 50 yards away. "Ready." Eleanor nodded, too breathless to speak. On Nathaniel's count, they sprinted toward the trees, zigzagging to present difficult targets. Murdoch's voice carried across the ravine, ordering his men to cross the stream in pursuit. They reached the forest just as the first of Murdoch's men began wading into the water. The dense pines provided better cover, allowing them to move more quickly while remaining hidden from view. For nearly an hour, they pushed deeper into the forest, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. Finally, when Eleanor felt she couldn't take another step, Nathaniel called a halt in a small clearing. "We've lost them for now," he said, checking the saddlebag to ensure the portfolio remained intact. "But they'll pick up our trail eventually. We need to reach Joseph before nightfall." Eleanor nodded, trying to ignore the trembling in her limbs and the burning pain across her back where several wounds had reopened during their flight. "How much farther?" "Less than 2 miles. Can you make it?" She straightened, summoning reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Lead on, Colonel." The ghost of a smile touched his lips at her use of his military rank, no longer an accusation, but something approaching affection. They continued their journey, moving more carefully now, alert for signs of pursuit. The sun was low on the horizon when they finally spotted smoke rising from the Paiute settlement. The collection of hide-covered lodges and wooden structures stood in a sheltered valley surrounded by pine forest and protected on one side by a steep cliff face. Several figures moved about the central area, and children played near a small stream that ran through the settlement. Nathaniel stopped at the edge of the clearing, raising his hands to show he carried no weapons. "We should approach openly," he said. "They'll have sentries watching." Sure enough, as they stepped from the tree line, 2 Paiute warriors appeared as if from nowhere, rifles held ready but not aimed directly at them. "I seek Joseph Crowfeather," Nathaniel called in greeting. "Tell him Nathaniel Reed brings important news and the daughter of Thomas Hayes." One of the warriors nodded in recognition, gesturing for them to follow, while the other maintained his watchful stance. As they entered the settlement, curious eyes followed their progress, especially Eleanor, whose bedraggled appearance and obvious exhaustion marked her as someone who had traveled far under difficult circumstances. Joseph Crowfeather emerged from the largest lodge as they approached. Despite his 65 years, he stood straight and tall, his weathered face bearing the dignity of a leader who had guided his people through decades of hardship. His dark eyes took in their condition at a glance. "My friend returns in troubled times," he said in English, his deep voice carrying the slight accent of one who learned the language as an adult, "and brings the daughter of the medicine man." "We come seeking sanctuary, Joseph," Nathaniel replied, "and bringing evidence of a great injustice planned against your people." Joseph nodded gravely. "Sarah Two Rivers told of your coming. The key was delivered." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "And it led us to what we sought, my father's proof of the conspiracy against your tribe." "Come," Joseph said, gesturing toward his lodge. "You are safe here. Rest, eat, then we will speak of these matters." Inside the lodge, Sarah Two Rivers waited. She immediately took charge of Eleanor, clucking disapprovingly at her wet clothing and the blood that had seeped through the back of her dress. "Wounds open again," she scolded gently. "Sit, I tend." While Sarah treated Eleanor's reopened wounds, Joseph's wife, Morning Sky, provided them with hot tea and a stew of venison and wild roots. The simple meal was the most welcome Eleanor could remember, restoring warmth and strength to her battered body. Once they had eaten and Eleanor's wounds were rebandaged, Joseph sat cross-legged before them, his expression solemn. "Now," he said, "show what Thomas Hayes died to protect." Nathaniel carefully removed the portfolio from the saddlebag, spreading the documents before Joseph. "Governor Kane and Victor Murdoch have been systematically stealing land that rightfully belongs to the Paiute under the Treaty of 1868, he explained. But that was only preparation for a larger plan. Joseph examined the documents with a keen eye that belied the common assumption that native peoples were illiterate or unsophisticated. "These show payments," he observed. "Bribes to officials." "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "And this letter outlines their full intention to forcibly relocate your entire tribe to the Nevada Territory, where conditions are unsuitable for your traditional way of life." Joseph's face remained impassive, but his eyes darkened with anger. "This has happened to many tribes. Government makes treaty, then breaks when convenient." He tapped one of the maps. "This marks sacred grounds, places where our ancestors rest, places where we hunt, gather medicine plants. My father discovered their plan while investigating irregular land transactions," Eleanor explained. "When he realized the full scope of the conspiracy, he began collecting evidence." "Thomas Hayes was honorable man," Joseph said. "Treated our people when others would not. Taught our healers his medicine." He looked up at Eleanor. "He spoke often of daughter with healing hands and fierce heart." Tears pricked Eleanor's eyes at this unexpected connection to her father, this evidence that he had spoken of her with pride to his friends among the Paiute. "These documents must reach federal authorities," Nathaniel said, bringing the discussion back to their immediate concern. Marshal Hollister was reassigned after receiving earlier evidence from Thomas. "We need to find another official who can't be influenced by Kane." Joseph considered this. "I have contact with Indian Agency in Helena, man named Richardson, honest for white government man." He pointed to a young warrior who had been sitting quietly near the lodge entrance. "Swift horse can ride to Helena tonight, 20 miles. Return with Richardson in 2 days." Nathaniel nodded. "That would be best. Murdoch's men will be watching all the regular routes. They won't expect a Paiute messenger." "What of you?" Joseph asked. "Murdoch will not stop hunting. He knows you are here." "He suspects but isn't certain," Nathaniel replied. "The storm and the forest covered our tracks. We should be safe until Richardson arrives." Joseph's expression suggested he wasn't convinced. "Murdoch has many men. Some were Confederate scouts during war, good trackers." He glanced at Eleanor. "And woman is injured, cannot run if attacked." "We'll defend the settlement if necessary," Nathaniel said firmly. "No," Joseph shook his head. "Too many women, children. If Murdoch brings many men, blood will flow." He was silent for a moment, thinking. "There is another place. Old cave and cliff wall. Our sacred place. Few know of it. You hide there until Richardson comes." Eleanor and Nathaniel exchanged glances. "Would your people allow outsiders in a sacred place?" she asked. "For daughter of Thomas Hayes and friend of Paiute." Joseph's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "Yes, spirits will understand necessity." It was decided. Swift Horse would depart immediately for Helena with copies of the most damning documents, while the originals would remain with Eleanor and Nathaniel. At dawn, Joseph himself would guide them to the cave hideaway where they would wait for Richardson's arrival. As night fell over the settlement, Eleanor found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. She sat outside Joseph's lodge, wrapped in a warm Paiute blanket, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. The settlement had grown quiet with only the occasional cry of a child or murmur of conversation breaking the stillness. Soft footsteps announced Nathaniel's approach before he spoke. "You should be resting," he said, settling beside her on the ground. "My mind won't quiet," she admitted. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Murdoch's face as he pursued us across that ravine, the hatred in his eyes. He's desperate. Men like Murdoch and Kane have built their power on the belief that they're untouchable. Your father's evidence threatens everything they've worked for." Eleanor nodded, drawing the blanket closer around her shoulders. "I keep thinking about Father, whether he knew what would happen when he began investigating, whether he was afraid." "He must have been," Nathaniel said quietly. "Only a fool wouldn't be afraid facing such powerful enemies. But he did it anyway. That's true courage." They sat in companionable silence for a time, the night sounds of the forest surrounding them, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine boughs, the distant howl of a wolf. "I've been thinking about Chancellorsville," Eleanor said suddenly. "About Henry and those 23 men." Nathaniel tensed beside her, but she continued before he could speak. "I've held on to my anger for so long, blamed you for a decision made in circumstances I can barely imagine." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "But these past days have shown me the weight of such choices, the responsibility of deciding between terrible options when lives hang in the balance." "Eleanor," he began, but she placed her hand gently on his arm. "I forgive you, Nathaniel, for Henry, for the choice you had to make." Her voice was steady, though tears glistened in her eyes. "And I thank you for remembering him all these years, for carrying his memory when I was too hurt to honor it properly." The simple words struck Nathaniel with the force of physical blows. For 11 years he had carried the weight of those deaths, the faces of those men appearing in his dreams, their names a litany he recited in private penance. Never had he expected forgiveness, least of all from the sister of the man who had led that doomed mission. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said roughly. "It's not about deserving," Eleanor replied. "It's about letting go of the past so we can face what's coming." She hesitated, then added softly, "Henry would want that for both of us." Before Nathaniel could respond, a commotion arose from the edge of the settlement. A sentry was calling out in the Paiute language, his voice urgent. Joseph emerged from his lodge, listening intently before turning to them. "Riders approaching," he said grimly. "Many, from south." Nathaniel was on his feet instantly. "Murdoch, how many?" "Sentry counts 12, maybe more." 12? Eleanor gasped. "That's not just Murdoch's men, that's—" "The territorial militia," Nathaniel finished. "Kane has called out official forces." Joseph's expression hardened. "They cannot enter Paiute land without breaking treaty." "Treaties haven't stopped them before," Nathaniel said bitterly. "Joseph, get your people ready to defend themselves, but don't fire first. Eleanor and I will leave immediately for the cave. If they're focused on finding us, they may leave the settlement alone." "Too late," Joseph replied, pointing to the torches now visible approaching through the trees. "They arrive soon. No time to reach cave." Nathaniel made a swift decision. "Then we stand with you. Where are the documents?" "Here." Eleanor produced the portfolio from within her blanket where she had kept it close. "Hide them," Nathaniel instructed. "Somewhere they won't think to look. Then both of you stay out of sight as much as possible. I'll speak with them first." As Eleanor hurried to conceal the portfolio, Nathaniel checked his weapons. The revolver was nearly empty after their earlier confrontation, but his rifle still had ammunition. Not enough to hold off 12 men, but perhaps enough to negotiate from a position of strength. The Paiute warriors had taken defensive positions around the perimeter of the settlement, armed with a mixture of traditional weapons and rifles acquired through trade. Women and children were being ushered into the lodges furthest from the approaching riders. Nathaniel took position beside Joseph at the settlement's entrance, watching as the column of mounted men emerged from the tree line. Victor Murdoch rode at the front alongside a man in the uniform of the territorial militia. Behind them came Murdoch's hired guns and several uniformed militiamen, all armed and grim-faced. "That's Captain Winters of the militia," Nathaniel murmured to Joseph. "Kane's man through and through." "What they want, they cannot have," Joseph replied simply. The riders halted 20 yards from the settlement entrance. Murdoch spurred his horse forward a few paces. "Reed," he called. "We know you're in there. You and the Hayes woman come out now, and no one else needs to get hurt." Nathaniel stepped forward, rifle held ready but not aimed. "This is Paiute land, Murdoch, protected by federal treaty. You have no authority here." Captain Winters urged his horse alongside Murdoch's. "We have every authority, Reed. Governor Kane has declared a state of emergency due to threats against territorial officials. We're here to arrest you and Eleanor Hayes on charges of theft, trespassing, and sedition." "Fabricated charges," Nathaniel replied coolly, "to cover up the real crimes, land fraud, corruption, and the murder of Thomas Hayes." Murmurs ran through the ranks of the militiamen at this accusation. Clearly not all had been fully informed of the situation. "Careful, Reed," Murdoch warned. "Slander against the territorial governor is a serious offense." "It's not slander when we have proof." Eleanor's voice rang out as she stepped from Joseph's lodge to stand beside Nathaniel. Despite her bedraggled appearance, she carried herself with dignity and determination. "Documents bearing the governor's signature detailing bribes and illegal land transactions. Evidence my father died to protect." Murdoch's face darkened with anger. "Where are these alleged documents?" "Safe," Eleanor replied, "and copies are already on their way to federal authorities in Helena." This was a calculated risk. Swift Horse had indeed departed for Helena, but had only just begun his journey. Yet the claim might give Murdoch and Winters pause. "You're bluffing," Murdoch scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Eleanor held his gaze steadily. "My father sent evidence to Marshal Hollister before his death. That's why Hollister was so hastily reassigned to Wyoming, but he wasn't the only federal official my father contacted." Nathaniel admired her quick thinking, creating just enough doubt to make Murdoch hesitate. Captain Winters, less personally invested than Murdoch, seemed more cautious now. "Regardless of these allegations, we have orders to take you both into custody." "And we refuse," Nathaniel stated flatly. "You're outnumbered, Captain. The Paiute warriors surrounding this settlement might not have your fancy uniforms, but they're expert marksmen. Start a fight here and many of your men won't ride home." It was a dangerous bluff. While the Paiute warriors were indeed skilled, they were outnumbered by the combined force of militia and Murdoch's men. A pitched battle would result in devastating casualties on both sides, and likely end with the territorial government using the incident as justification for even harsher measures against the tribe. Winters surveyed the settlement, noting the positioned warriors, then glanced at his own men. Several looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation, having enlisted to maintain order in the territory, not to attack a peaceful native settlement on dubious grounds. "Perhaps a compromise," the captain suggested, ignoring Murdoch's scowl. "Surrender the documents you claim to have and we'll withdraw to discuss their contents with the governor. If your allegations have merit, appropriate action will be taken." "So you can destroy the evidence?" Eleanor shook her head. "We're not fools, Captain." The standoff continued, tension building with each passing moment. Nathaniel knew they were in an impossible situation. Even if they survived an initial confrontation, reinforcements would eventually arrive. The Paiute would suffer, and the evidence might still be lost. Just as it seemed violence was inevitable, a commotion arose from the rear of the militia column. Riders were approaching from the east, a small group moving at speed toward the confrontation. As they drew closer, Nathaniel made out the distinctive uniform of federal marshals. "Federal agents," he murmured to Eleanor. "But how?" The newcomers rode directly up to Captain Winters, their leader a stern-faced man in his 50s, producing official documentation. "Captain Winters, I'm Chief Marshal Richard Hollister," he announced in a carrying voice. "These men are under my jurisdiction now. Stand down your militia. Winters stared in shocked recognition. Marshal Hollister, you were reassigned to Wyoming territory. I was, temporarily. Hollister's gaze swept over the assembled militia Murdoch's men and the Paiute defenders. That reassignment has been rescinded in light of new evidence concerning corruption in the Montana territorial government. Murdoch's face had gone ashen. What evidence? He demanded. What are you talking about? Hollister ignored him, focusing on Winters. Captain, you have a choice. Withdraw your men now, or face charges of obstruction of federal justice. Governor Kane is already in custody in Helena. A murmur of shock ran through the militiamen. Winters hesitated, clearly torn between his orders and the sudden appearance of federal authority. He's bluffing, Murdoch hissed. Kane can't be in custody. We just left him in Eagle Ridge yesterday. But Hollister produced a telegram. This arrived in Helena this morning. Governor Marshall Kane was arrested in Eagle Ridge at dawn by federal agents from Bozeman. The charges include corruption, fraud, and conspiracy to murder. Eleanor stepped forward. Marshal Hollister, I'm Eleanor Hayes, Thomas Hayes's daughter. Recognition flashed in the marshal's eyes. Miss Hayes, your father was a brave man. His initial evidence put us on Kane's trail, but it wasn't quite enough for an arrest. We've been building the case for months. We have the rest of the evidence, she said. My father's final proof detailed records of the land fraud scheme and plans to forcibly relocate the Paiute tribe. Hollister nodded grimly. That would complete our case. I'd like to see those documents as soon as possible. Captain Winters, seeing the tide had turned, ordered his militia to stand down. Several of Murdoch's men, sensing their employer's imminent arrest, quietly slipped away during the confusion. Murdoch himself sat rigid in his saddle, hatred burning in his eyes as he stared at Nathaniel and Eleanor. This isn't over, he growled. Actually, it is, Hollister replied, gesturing to two of his deputies. Victor Murdoch, you're under arrest for conspiracy, land fraud, and accessory to murder. As the deputies moved to take Murdoch into custody, he suddenly spurred his horse, breaking through the circle of men. He drew his revolver, aiming directly at Eleanor. You'll join your father, he shouted, squeezing the trigger. Several shots rang out simultaneously. Nathaniel had thrown himself in front of Eleanor, his rifle raised. Joseph and his warriors had fired, as well as had Marshal Hollister and his deputies. Murdoch tumbled from his horse, multiple bullets having found their mark. He lay motionless in the dirt, his final act of vengeance thwarted by the very people he had sought to destroy. In the stunned silence that followed, Eleanor found herself trembling, supported by Nathaniel's steady arm around her waist. The violence had ended as suddenly as it had erupted, leaving in its wake a strange hollow feeling, not triumph, but the exhausted relief that comes with surviving a terrible storm. Are you hurt? Nathaniel asked urgently, his eyes scanning her for injuries. No, she whispered. You. He shook his head, though a grimace suggested one of his old wounds had been aggravated by his sudden movement. Marshal Hollister approached them, holstering his weapon. I apologize for cutting it so close. We've been tracking Kane and Murdoch for months, ever since Thomas Hayes first contacted me. When he was killed, I knew we had to move carefully. You were reassigned, Eleanor said, still trying to understand. To Wyoming. A ruse, Hollister explained. My superiors in Washington arranged it to make Kane believe he was safe while we continued gathering evidence. I never stopped working the case. He smiled slightly. Your father was a good man, Miss Hayes. He believed in justice above all else. As did his son, Nathaniel added quietly, meeting Eleanor's gaze. In the days that followed, the full extent of Kane and Murdoch's conspiracy was revealed. The evidence Thomas Hayes had gathered, combined with what Marshal Hollister had accumulated, exposed a network of corruption that reached beyond Montana into neighboring territories. Several territorial officials were arrested, and land illegally taken from the Paiute was ordered returned. Joseph Crow Feather and his people celebrated with a ceremony honoring Thomas Hayes's memory and the courage of his daughter. Eleanor found herself welcomed into their community in a way few white women ever experienced, learning healing techniques from Sarah Two Rivers and stories of the land from Joseph himself. Nathaniel remained at her side throughout his quiet strength, a constant presence, as she navigated the complex emotions of grief, vindication, and uncertain future. The ranch he had built on land that turned out to be rightfully Paiute became a symbol of cooperation rather than conquest, a place where native knowledge and European agricultural techniques merged to benefit both communities. One evening, a week after Murdoch's death and Cain's arrest, Eleanor and Nathaniel stood on a bluff overlooking the valley, where both the Paiute settlement and Nathaniel's ranch were visible in the distance. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, the beauty almost painful in its intensity. "What will you do now?" Nathaniel asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Return to Chicago, your nursing career." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "No," she finally said. "I don't think so. There's work to be done here, healing between communities, building something new from all this pain and injustice." She turned to face him. "What about you? Will you return to your solitude?" Nathaniel gazed out over the land he had come to love, despite his initial desire merely to disappear within it. "I've lived with ghosts for too long," he said quietly. 23 men whose faces I see each night, your brother Henry among them." "And now?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft. "Now?" He turned to her, his gray eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "Now I see the living. I see you, Eleanor Hayes. And for the first time in 11 years, the past doesn't outweigh the present." She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. "Is that enough to build a future on?" "It's a beginning," he replied, his hand finding hers. "The land teaches patience. Growth takes time, especially after harsh seasons." Eleanor smiled, twining her fingers with his. "My father would have liked that metaphor. He always said healing can't be rushed." Wise man Thomas Hayes. "Yes," she agreed. "And I think he and Henry would approve of this. Of us." Nathaniel didn't answer with words. Instead, he gently drew her closer, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. But Eleanor Hayes, who had faced public whipping, pursued her father's killers, and helped expose a conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of territorial government, knew exactly what she wanted. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people who had known too much loss, testing the waters of newfound connection. But it deepened with the certainty that comes from shared struggle and mutual respect, a promise more binding than any spoken oath. When they finally drew apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky above. Nathaniel kept his arm around Eleanor's waist as they turned to walk back toward the settlement. "It won't be easy," he said. "There will be those who resent what we've done, who lost position or profit when Cain fell." "Nothing worthwhile is ever easy," Eleanor replied. "But we're not alone in this. Joseph and his people, Marshall Hollister, Dr. Morrison, they stand with us. And we have each other," Nathaniel added softly. "No small thing that." "No," Eleanor agreed, resting her head against his shoulder. "No small thing at all." 6 months later, on a clear spring day, Eleanor Hayes and Nathaniel Reed were married in a ceremony that blended Christian traditions with Paiute rituals of blessing. Joseph Crow Feather spoke of new beginnings rising from painful pasts, and Dr. Morrison read passages about healing and hope. The newly appointed territorial governor attended a signal of the changing relationship between the government and the Paiute tribe. Marshall Hollister came from Helena, bringing news that the federal investigations sparked by Thomas Hayes's evidence had resulted in significant reforms to land management throughout the Western Territories. After the ceremony, as guests celebrated with food and music, Eleanor slipped away to a quiet spot overlooking the valley. In her hand, she held her father's brass key, the key that had unlocked not only the evidence of conspiracy, but in many ways her own future. Nathaniel found her there, his approach announced by the soft crunch of pine needles beneath his boots. "Remembering?" he asked, joining her at the overlook. "Honoring," she corrected. "Father, Henry, the 23 men from Chancellorsville, All those who sacrificed so we could stand here today. Nathaniel nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the eastern sky. "I've been thinking about what to call this place," he said after a while. "Not just my ranch or the Paiute settlement, but this whole valley we're building together. And my promised land," he suggested. "Not because it was given to us, but because of the promise we make to those who will come after, that this will be a place of justice, of healing, where the past is honored but doesn't dictate the future." Eleanor considered this, the name settling into her heart with the rightness of truth long sought. "Promised land," she repeated. "Yes, I think that fits." As darkness deepened over the Montana landscape, they made their way back to the celebration, where two communities, once divided by history and circumstance, now danced together under the vast sky. Not forgetting the wounds of the past, but choosing to build something new upon their scars. In the years that followed, the story of Eleanor Hayes and Nathaniel Reed became part of the valley's lore, a tale of justice pursued at great cost, of redemption found in unlikely places, and of an oath made not with words, but with lives dedicated to a vision of what the American frontier could truly become. A promised land earned through sacrifice and protected by those who understood its true value. The end.